This video is brought to you by NordVPN, the best online VPN service for speed and security. Check out the link in the description or stick around to learn more. California high-speed rail is an incredibly controversial topic, but it shouldn't be. I actually had a video on the project, but it was lost in the great RMTransit video takedown of 2022. Might make a video about that in the future, and so I thought, hey, maybe it's time to upgrade it and replace it. To be clear, California has the only world-beating high-speed rail project in the whole of the Americas. And that means it has obvious potential, but it also deserves a lot of scrutiny. Of course, connecting the largest US state, which has a population larger than that of Canada, and an economy which is only bettered by a couple countries in the entire world, is an obviously good idea. And even though I am Canadian, I have a stake in this too. I have family in California, but probably more importantly, anytime high-speed rail projects come up anywhere else in North America, people look to California because it's the only place building a true, large-scale high-speed rail project. Ultimately, America has a big influence on the entire world, but it's especially influential in Canada. Now, in advocacy spheres, criticizing big projects is always touchy. At the same time, it's really important to separate criticisms about the way the project has been undertaken with criticisms of the project itself. I don't like the way that California high-speed rail has been undertaken, but I've made literally hundreds of videos about public transportation and high-speed rail all around the world. I'm on board with the project. And I'm going to touch on this a bit later, but you can be on board with California high-speed rail without being on board with the project that's delivering it. People have suggested to me that the project is reforming and getting better with time, and I think that if that's true, that would be great, but we need to wait and see if policy improvements bear fruit. Public projects obviously need to be accountable to the public, but in large part, this video isn't really about the project California high-speed rail. Rather, it's about the discourse on the internet and in advocacy spheres about it. I've talked a lot about the challenge of being passionate about projects, but still needing to find the space to criticize them. This is really important. Not criticizing projects which are going badly is the wrong kind of balance. It might be winning the battle, but it's losing the war. If transit is slow and expensive to build, well, even if the political stars align, it's going to be challenging to get it done. This video is meant to not be 3 hours long, and so I'm going to mostly focus on what I see as high-level issues, pointing you off to different resources where you can learn more. Obviously, there are tons of technical discussions you can get into about what mountain passes to take or how fast trains should actually go. And I've gotten into lots of discussions over the years about those exact topics with people. But at some point, these micro discussions come together into something larger. And if that greater whole has problems, well then the individual issues stop mattering as much. High-speed rail in Spain and Japan and Italy face tons of technical hurdles, the same sorts of technical hurdles that California faces. And a lot of the high-speed rail lines in those countries were built before the internet existed, and before tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail already existed that you could study and learn from. I'm just not confident that micro-level technical issues are the main things behind macro-level cost blowouts and long timelines. At the same time, this is not a criticism of a particular government or government agency. The California high-speed rail project is owned by the public, and as a human being who is proud of a lot of what humanity has created and who wants more public transit built, I want to see the project successful as well. Ultimately, failures are collective failures, and successes are collective successes. It's certainly bad if one level of government doesn't transfer enough funds to another level of government so that that level of government can staff up and start planning and designing things. But spending too much time trying to distribute blame feels like a waste of time, because ultimately it's the project that owns those problems. It's the project that's ending up costing a lot of money, and it's the project that's taking longer than it needs to. And that's even as it was planned to start by traversing what should be a relatively low cost and simple environment to build in. At the end of the day, I assume basically everybody who's watching this video, at least the intended audience, is mostly on board with California high-speed rail. But I find it very hard to believe that there aren't a lot of alternative worlds and approaches where this project got done more quickly and for less money. Okay, that was a lot of preamble, let's roll the intro. To get the ball rolling with Cal HSR, the natural place to start is the project phasing. There are a lot of different reasons I've heard over the years in discussions with different people about why the project started with an isolated segment in the Central Valley of California. which as far as I have seen in any technical document or presentation will be complete long before any connection to a major coastal center like Los Angeles or San Francisco. The issue is, I think this is a structural problem. I know that California's Central Valley has a number of mid-sized cities, but I don't think mid-sized cities alone will make for good high-speed rail. And even though, of course, the plan is to go further to larger cities, at least initially, the Central Valley cities are all we have. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people who want to travel from, say, Merced to Fresno, but there's going to be a lot more people who want to travel to Fresno from San Francisco. And San Francisco and San Jose have more than 10 times the population of Merced. At the same time, while the Central Valleys are bigger than you might imagine, Fresno has over 500,000 people. I'm skeptical that these cities are going to generate as much ridership as, say, a smaller European city like Rennes. Now, Rennes is connected to the French TGV network, and it has only around half the population of Fresno, but it's more compact. And it has a metro system linking to the high-speed rail station that gets over 200,000 riders every single day. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a future video where I go into detail on Rennes. Ultimately, of course, high-speed rail isn't only about connecting the biggest cities in a direct straight line, but connecting the biggest cities to a high-speed rail network is a huge part of the value proposition, including for residents of the smaller cities who want to be able to visit those larger cities and access the amenities they have available. While ridership from Paris to Rennes or Hakodate to Sendai might be respectable, the meat and potatoes of the high-speed rail world are the Lyon to Paris route and the Osaka to Tokyo route. Of course, there's also the economic argument. By starting in the Central Valley, you send a ton of economic stimulus its way, and that's a good idea. Funneling more of the financial benefits of big infrastructure projects to disadvantaged communities is something I can get behind. But my personal belief is that a high-speed rail line connecting the Central Valley to even just one of the major coastal centers in California would have a far bigger economic impact than high-speed rail existing, but only within the Central Valley. I don't want the Central Valley to be ignored. It's just that I'm not convinced that an islanded high-speed rail line in the Central Valley is actually better for the Central Valley than a line which connects the Central Valley to a major urban center that has a massive booming economy. Now, there will definitely be comments saying funding was insufficient to get to the coast, but I'll address the issue of cost a bit later on in the video. Ultimately, my meta-commentary on this whole issue is that just because a commentator doesn't agree with the justifications or the outcomes they've led to, doesn't mean that they don't understand that those justifications exist. I find with California high-speed rail, there's this air of inevitability with a lot of the decisions that have been made. To some extent, that makes sense. It's hard to look back on the past and imagine different ways things could have gone, path dependency and all, but I think that misses the point. One topic that gets thrown around a lot are the plans drafted up by SNCF, the French National Railway, which has built a lot of high-speed rail lines over the last several decades. These plans would have supposedly cost a lot less, but would have taken a different route between San Francisco and Los Angeles. On one side, people who have a bone to pick with California high-speed rail say these plans are as good as gold. And on the other side, people claim that SNCF's plans wouldn't meet the government's legal stipulations and mandates, and thus weren't even relevant in the first place. But instead of just talking past each other, the discussion that probably should have happened is, hey, SNCF's plan has some good elements to it, doesn't it? Maybe we could change the government's mandates, but still meet the objectives behind those mandates so that we could use a less expensive plan while still getting out of the project what we want to get out of it. One such topic is how the Central Valley cities are served. If all trains need to run through the Central Valley cities, the main line needs to be in one location. But if you serve them on branches or with shuttles in some cases, then the main line could be in a different location. And this is not an uncommon way to serve cities on rail transportation systems. Look at the Mini Shinkansen or the Hokuriku Shinkansen, for example. Some people took issue with how in my Texas Central video, which I'll link up here, I talked about how I prefer the way that project is serving major urban centers on the first phase, as opposed to California high-speed rail. Now, to be clear, some people criticize me because LA and San Francisco are technically in phase 1, even though the first operating phase isn't actually phase 1, it's the initial operating segment, but I digress. The reality is, yes, the Central Valley cities are major urban centers, but they are not cities of multiple millions of people each, like Dallas and Houston or San Francisco and Los Angeles, not to mention San Jose. And the reality is, Dallas to Houston is the entire Texas Central project. There's only 3 stations, and while at least one of the station locations is not great, it still serves the Houston metropolitan area. Basically, Texas Central, if it loses the connections to the major cities, is just one station. It's not a rail line. But California High-Speed Rail, if it never constructs the connections to San Francisco and Los Angeles, well, it is still an operating high-speed rail line, just one between a lot of cities which aren't all that large, even by international standards. I've heard the argument before that this was a strategic decision. If the Central Valley segment got built first, future politicians would have to complete the project, lest they have a California high-speed rail albatross lying around their necks. But looking around the world, there are a lot of major infrastructure projects which got started but never got finished. I'm just not confident that this is a good approach. All of this means that I think the approach taken with the Central Valley is extremely risky. Because if things don't go well, and a lot of people, including infrastructure experts, have argued they aren't, it gives people a lot of ammunition to kill this project in the cradle. The next major topic is the cost of the project. California high-speed rail is incredibly expensive in the context of high-speed rail projects around the world. Modern projects, including ones which travel through substantial seismic zones and mountainous areas, have been built for significantly less money. Now, Marco Kitty has made the very cogent point that the US is so rich that it can afford to build California high-speed rail even with its extremely high costs. But of course, that doesn't mean he doesn't believe getting the cost down is a good thing, because lower costs mean more high-speed rail for the same budget, and that budget has not come easy. At the same time, saying the cost of a major infrastructure project doesn't matter is bad. It's an incentive for further cost creep, and further cost creep tends to lead to delays as projects desperately try to shave down the cost. Even if the price of California high-speed rail doesn't concern you, the long timeline, which has in part been caused because of budgetary issues, should. It's pretty common when you look at high-speed rail projects around the world, which I have, that they take 5 or 10 years to complete. But California high-speed rail has taken longer, and that's just for the section in the Central Valley. And perhaps funding distributed better to different agencies would have made the project move faster and more efficiently. But ultimately, on the whole, the project has been one of the most expensive in the world. Now, I've heard the argument that we should probably be okay with budget overruns, because even the original high-speed rail line, the Tokaido Shinkansen between Osaka and Tokyo, was over budget. But this argument doesn't make sense if the budget for that project was quite low, and it was. The Tokaido Shinkansen still cost substantially less than California high-speed rail, and this was as they were literally inventing the high-speed rail concept as they were going along. At the same time, the project was finished in just about 5 years for the Tokyo 1964 Olympic Games. It wasn't a long project, and it wasn't all that expensive. What makes more sense is arguments about how since the US doesn't build a lot of high-speed rail, it doesn't have the institutional capacity and thus isn't very effective at it. And that is a real problem, but high costs aren't coming from a single source, like the consultants needed to staff up agencies that don't have the in-house capabilities. The Transit Cost Project at NYU has some great research into some of the various factors that cause infrastructure projects to cost as much as they do in the US. And the reality is that technical design, litigation, land acquisition costs, and other factors play just as much of a role as consultants. All of this should make us want to dive deep, learn from other countries, and progressively build high-speed rail construction knowledge in the United States. The brute force, just spend more money until the project gets done approach isn't what made countries like Korea and Italy so effective at building high-speed rail. It was learning and thoughtful development of a capable public sector that was able to coordinate and develop projects. At the same time, appeals to the fact that tons of money is spent on the military or highways are reasonable in context, but the truth is that those branches of government have also become far less effective at building large projects cost effectively. And so the idea that we can just transfer our highway building focus into a rail building focus isn't quite so simple, especially because we need to build a lot of rail and we need to do it quickly. What's funny about all of this is that you don't have to look far to find a cost-effective transit project in the US that we could be learning from. Amtrak's electrification of the northernmost part of the Northeast Corridor back in the 1990s was actually done incredibly cost-effectively. It was less than $1 billion. Ultimately, and broadly speaking, high costs are a big problem for any infrastructure project. But they're an especially big problem for California high-speed rail because the project started with what should have been the lowest cost segment through the mostly low density and mostly flat Central Valley. Even if all things are held equal, lower costs are just better. To round my major points off, we have the fact that California high-speed rail isn't just funding the Central Valley segment of high-speed rail, but also connecting projects in the major urban centers on the coast. These projects don't get enough attention because they mostly don't include building gigantic viaducts and high-speed right-of-ways that work their way across the Central Valley. Probably the biggest other project funded with California high-speed rail funding has been the electrification and modernization of Caltrain with the very creatively named CalMod project. This will electrify the Caltrain line from San Jose to San Francisco and modernize it with better, higher capacity signaling, allowing California high-speed rail to piggyback on the line. And again, as with high-speed rail, this is a good project on its fundamentals, and the trains that are going to be used on it are honestly better than anything currently operating in Canada or the US, or frankly the Western Hemisphere. But it really has not all gone well. Electrification has been over budget, and the initial budget was high, and it's coming in late. At the same time, the unique signaling system, which was used instead of, say, the European train control system, which is used in China, albeit a modified version, Australia, India, Latin America, and Europe, has also had a ton of major issues. At the same time, there are some serious question marks over a lot of the major components of the Caltrain modernization project, including stations and grade separations. The fantastic Caltrain high-speed rail compatibility blog, which I've been following for years and years, is a great resource to learn more about the incredible complexity of connecting Caltrain with high-speed rail. And as I hope will be obvious, despite these problems not being of California high-speed rail's making, they are problems which California high-speed rail will need to deal with. And I think it's worth stepping back and asking how other countries dealt with similar problems, because other countries also had to get their high-speed trains through dense city centers without modern signaling technologies like ATCS. Now, before I close the video out with my conclusions, I'm thinking about traveling a lot in the next year so I can see more high-speed rail in the steel, as well as traveling to other cities around the world to bring you on-the-ground coverage of cool metro, bus, and tram projects, with a very special trip coming in just over a month's time. This is where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes in. I always like to travel with a VPN ready on my devices, and Nord has been a stable presence for the past couple of trips I've taken. I use Nord to stay protected when I'm using sketchy cafe public Wi-Fi, and I'm able to connect to a server back home in Canada to access apps and websites that aren't easily available wherever I am. And of course vice versa when I'm actually at home, to any of Nord's over 5,600 servers in 59 countries. And now NordVPN even offers a proxy browser extension, which means I can browse the internet safely and enjoy the comforts of threat protection even if I'm on a public device abroad, without the hassle of needing to download an app and allowing me to choose which websites I want to use a VPN to connect to. I have separate browser profiles for personal and YouTube use, so Nord's browser extension allows me to connect to other countries' internet for easier research, but to stay on my own home country's internet to connect to things like social media, all at the same time. As you might know, my full-time career is on the internet, and so it's even more crucial for me that I can get my work done safely and conveniently no matter where I am. NordVPN comes with threat protection, an advanced anti-malware feature that blocks intrusive ads as well as web trackers, so that my content, my business, and myself can stay safe and I can keep bringing you new videos. Go to nordvpn.com/RMTransit to learn more about everything NordVPN has to offer, and to sweeten the deal even more, right now there's a back-to-school promotion going on where every purchase of a 2-year plan will receive 4 bonus months on top. For all my urban planning, civil engineering, or other student viewers, this is a great deal for using the internet safely in your dorm or at the library, and if you're not a student, it's a massive discount for a really useful service. Just make sure to use my link nordvpn.com/RMTransit because you'll be directly supporting my channel by helping me secure further sponsorships with NordVPN. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Taking things to first principles, here are some general things we need to take back. First, just because the law requires something does not mean we should accept it. Laws and regulations are made by human beings, generally with good intentions. But people also generally acknowledge that a lot of them are deeply broken and lead to things like transit projects needing to go through thousands of pages of environmental impact studies. Clearly something is off when laws meant to protect the environment are slowing down projects like electric trains and clean energy. Sometimes you need to be open to the idea that changing the law is the best way to make a big project possible or more practical. And sometimes it might even be the easiest and least expensive approach, because remember, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars here. Many countries, including the US, have made laws and repealed laws to make building major infrastructure simpler and faster, and to avoid litigation slowing everything down. At the same time, there are clearly structural issues at play. The entire time I was making this video, I was reminded in the back of my mind about discussions currently going on in California about how overhead wire electrification for railways was technically and financially infeasible. This is despite the fact that overhead line electrification is commonplace around the world, including in countries that are far poorer than the United States. Somehow, instead of fixing these structural problems, the proposed solution is engineering entirely new types of trains for US mainline use based on hydrogen and battery technology. Remember, all of this is being done to avoid what is considered a financially infeasible approach of using an existing technology used all around the world. And remember, we face the same problems in Canada. GO Transit's electrification project was stalled for the better part of a year, because someone said we have to make sure that hydrogen-powered trains, a solution not adopted by any major suburban railways in the world, weren't the best solution for us. The reality is, for so many of our problems in North America, the solutions are not technological, they're political and regulatory. So often on this continent, we try to engineer and spend our way around much more fundamental problems that if we were to just fix, we'd probably realize we should have fixed long ago. Alan Fisher has a great video on electrifying mainline railroads that I'll link somewhere around here that you can take a look at for more information on this. And then there's the big one, the sense of inevitability and the desire to reinvent the wheel for the US context, sometimes because of environmental concerns with high-speed electric trains. While this approach might be possible, that doesn't make it the best approach. For example, and only for example, while some might say that the US adopting entirely foreign regulations for its high-speed rail network might be completely impractical or just a bad idea, I don't necessarily see it that way. It at least seems like something which could hypothetically happen in some alternative dimension. And if it was done and it got high-speed rail built, would it really not be worth it? Korea, when it was getting started with high-speed rail, basically wholesale adopted the French approach to high-speed rail. It built out its first lines, and over the years, as it slowly developed, it's gotten better and better at doing things its own Korean way, to the point that Korea is one of the world's high-speed rail leaders. I just think people leap way too quickly to saying things could have only happened a certain way. The inevitable is just that, until it isn't, because every decision is made by a person, and people can change their minds. At the end of the day, I don't live in California, but I'm also not unfamiliar with it, and I'm not unimpacted by the decisions that go on there. As I said earlier, I have family in California, and I've spent a ton of time all across the state, including in the Central Valley, albeit mostly near Sacramento and Bakersfield, so not really the middle. I also did grow up on the west coast of Canada, which culturally often feels like it looks more to the west coast of the US than to the rest of Canada. And since back when I was a kid, I remember watching local news talking about California's bold high-speed rail plans. I was very excited. I was a kid who had a TGV poster in my bedroom. I think that it's good that things are happening, and California should obviously have high-speed rail. But I'm also very supportive of California having the best high-speed rail possible. And every improvement to how things are happening, every cost reduction, every better alignment only serves to make that project and all of the projects that follow, from high-speed rail to Vancouver, to high-speed rail to Atlanta, to new high-speed rail to New York, better. Cheerleading a project I already think should happen when I see clear issues that need to be resolved with it just feels like me doing a disservice to the project and to the greater cause. Ultimately, it's because I don't believe that anything is really inevitable here. Things can change for the better. Thanks for watching.